ball bearings. Okay, and essentially what that is that's two ball bearings pressed together. They've got a common outer housing, but if you look inside of it, you'll see that that inner race is two separate halves. One for that set and one for that set. Are we good? Now, that's off a front wheel drive axle. Okay, and usually there's a big old nut on the end of that. Is everybody following me here? I don't want anybody lost on this. Okay. If that nut is not as tight as it should be, or it gets loose, what happens is one of those races grabs like it's supposed to, and the other one doesn't. Does everybody see how that inner bearing, how this one grabbed and that one slipped? That's a fairly common, I shouldn't say it's fairly common, but it happens more than you might like or understand. And the reason for it, I mean, you take it off, you change the bearing, you put it back on, right? Do you care what caused it? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. The fact is, if you take it off and you put it back together right, you won't have this problem, correct? Okay. Does that make sense to everybody as far as the two have? Okay. So that part of the lesson is done. Bushing. Oh yes, I wanted to use this bushing to make a point. Yes, Tim. Start writing. Okay. Bushings also direct fluid. They're not just there to support the shaft and keep it aligned with the bearing. Okay. For instance, everybody sees those notches? Okay. So if that's an oil port and it's supposed to lube the bearing, and you install it that way, how much oil does that bearing get now? How much longer is that bearing going to last? Okay. That's part of it. The other is, maybe the oil goes in here and comes out of there. In a lot of automatic transmissions, they use the bushing as a pathway. And if you don't get it lined up, you'll shut the oil off to a clutch. Now you don't have second gear or fourth gear or something like that because it's twisted. You're restricting the oil. Everybody's good? Okay, there's a lot of stuff like that in automatics. So what I want you to write down is before you take something apart, ask yourself, how many ways can you install it wrong? That's anything you ever take apart. Okay, how many ways can I put this in wrong? Tim, give me an example of how I could put that in wrong. What? I cannot put it in wrong that way. Oh, rotate. Okay, what's the term that we're going to use for that? Clocking. Okay, so if you got to make sure that the clocking is right. So when you take something out, if you can't see that groove, what can you do to save your ass? Exactly. For instance, if this is, you're looking at a housing like this, that's your bushing, all you're going to have to do is take some white out and do that. Okay, so when you press it out, you say, oh shit, there's all kinds of holes and passages in here. Then you can say, okay, yeah, that one lines up here, that one and you start gaining an understanding of how this works, how this lubricates. Because it may be lubrication, or it may be clutch apply or band apply. Are we good? Okay. What else can I do wrong? Shortly. I'm playing with it still. How else can I put this in wrong? I could put it in upside down. Far corner until I figure out who you are. What else can I do wrong with this?
Not in all the
I
way.
can put it in too far down or not far enough in, correct? That's just one little bushing. Okay? All right. That's out of the way. Bushing construction, not going to take too long. That's a one-piece bushing, right? Nod your heads, even if you don't know. What they do is they just take a flat piece of steel and they wrap it around something round, and then we have a one-piece bushing, right? What do they make two-piece and three-piece bushings? Yes, they do. Where do you find a two-piece bushing? This, what?
They should come together.
No, where do you find one? Give me an example of where you've seen a two-piece bushing. What? No, not usually. Engine bearings, rod bearings, crank bearings. Those are basically bushings, aren't they? Plain bearings, but they're two-piece, correct? How precise are they? Very. This not quite as precise because it doesn't have to be. Okay, why does this not have to be as precise as a crank bearing or a rod bearing?
Does it only turn one direction?
Engine only turns one direction. Okay. Okay, here's what. Okay, in a transmission, standard or automatic, all the shafts do is rotate, correct? And all the force on it is rotational force. Okay? On an engine, we've got a crankshaft and a rod, right? Okay. What I've got here is this rod's going up and down, back and forth, right? Every time it changes direction, it's got a great big hammering force on it, right? There is no force like that in a transmission, is there? No, not at this point. Excuse me, there isn't. So if you're not sure, write that down. If you are sure of that and you know it, don't bother wasting your time writing things you already know. No questions on this? This is going quieter and quicker than maybe it should, but that's okay. We'll find out when it's a test time. Okay. Yeah, on the transmit, I guess I'm going to do this first. Okay, what makes this shaft turn? This shaft turning, correct? There's no loads or anything being pushed from the side. It's all strictly rotational, correct? So that's why we don't have to be within a half a thousandths. If we've got 5 thousandths, 9 times out of 10, 5 thousandths is well within spec. Okay. Okay, next thing. I guess I want to do this. Okay. That's half a bearing. That's half a bearing. Okay. This one's got a loop groove in it. Does everybody see that? Or actually, I should have painted the groove this way. Okay. Now, I'm going to make this a shaft that's going to go on it. So I'm going to have one shaft that's hollow drilled. So oil goes in here and comes out the side wherever it's drilled. Everybody can envision that? Okay. So what happens is, as that's spinning, because I've got my shaft in here, and it's spinning, there's an oil hole in that shaft, and it's pumping oil into that groove, right? So I have oil, 360 degrees worth of lubrication, right? Okay. Now, if I put that same shaft through here, and I don't have the groove, that oil is going to oil it only once every 360 degrees, correct? Okay. So this is always better? You are cowardly. Nobody's going to commit to that? Okay. Here's the thing. You're going to find this more in a transmission than you will an engine. Because when an engine comes down with that rod is going to take that oil film. There's the shaft inside, and let's say that the oil is pumping out here. Okay. If I've got a groove there, then it loops it all the way around. Now, when the rod comes down and this is pointed out here, That rod pushes down and the oil in here gets squeezed back into the crankshaft. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. How much force do I have coming down on that journal with a crankshaft? I mean, with a piston on top of it.
A lot.
On a power stroke, I've got probably 600 psi on a piston with 6 square inches, right? So that's about 3,000 pounds of downward force, right? How much oil pressure do I have squirting oil out of here? When my engine's cold and my bearings are good, I got 80 psi, correct? Which way do you think the oil's going to go? It's going to go from 3,000 pounds back into the crank, isn't it? Nod your head. Yeah, that's exactly what it's going to do. So if you don't have that groove there, then it's hard for that oil to get pushed back in. Does that make sense?
So you gotta have the oil to get it to hold it.
Well, I'm not saying that one is right and one's wrong. I'm just saying there's different applications for it. In a transmission, there's not that 3,000 pounds of pushing that bearing off to the side. So I don't need a plain bearing to have that oil in there. Most of you have looked at rod bearings and they're plain. There's no groove in there, right? Okay. That's so the oil will support. That's like having 2 separate ones or one big one. Which is harder to squeeze the oil out of? That's a lot harder to squeeze the oil out of, right? So if we know we're going to have a big load, we may groove the bottom half, but maybe not the top half where the load's going to be, as an example. And I'm doing that not because that's transmissions, I'm doing that because it's a bearing thing. Okay. We're going to run into plain bearings and we're going to run into roller bearings all through transmissions in this class. And so you're just going to have to be able to look at them and figure out what you're... If it's working fine, use the same bushing over, right? If you find that you've got a customer that's doing something to keep tearing that bushing or that bushing up, you may want to re-engineer the transmission so that that customer doesn't have that problem. Does that make sense? Okay, we'll get more into this later. I'm just trying to make you aware of the concept. Okay, running fit. On a bushing, 1 piece, 2 piece, 3 piece, doesn't matter. What happens is that shaft is not supposed to touch that bearing, correct? I'm supposed to have oil in here all the time, correct? So if the oil's too thin, it gets squished out too easy. What happens if the oil's too thick? Then the oil doesn't get in there. You know, you're trying to spin an engine or transmission because they're bolted together, right? At 5,000 RPM. So if it's too thick, and I'm trying to pump oil in there, the oil lubricates maybe half of that, but this part's dry. That's when you spin a crank bearing, as an example. Does that make sense? Okay. What needs more oil pressure? A roller, a anti-friction bearing, or a friction bearing? Say that loud enough so that you're committed. Friction bearings take a lot more oil pressure because you've only got 2,000 worth of clearance in there usually, right? Maybe 5. Okay, so you got to have more oil pressure to force that oil in. On a roller bearing, all you got to do is throw a couple of drops on it every now and then and it's happy. Okay, lubrication isn't the big thing that tears these up. Load is what tears these up. These wear out because of dirty oil usually. Any questions on this at this point?
Don't like the corner.
What? Oh, okay. Let's see, what else do I have on my list here? That side's done. You don't like the corner?